Greetings, everybody. Hello and welcome. My name is Tamara Payne, and I am the co-author of The Dead Are Rising: The Life of Malcolm X with my father, Les Payne, who unfortunately passed away 7 years ago last on Wednesday. That just passed. So this has been a really incredible week for me. I'm just going to get us started. There's been a black explosion of Black women biographies, which has given us a much needed nuanced view of history. They have rounded out the historical record, revealed the roles Black women have played, and given us insight into their lives, loves, and struggles. This is the power of biography, connecting us with history through the stories of lives lived. As we watch the dismantling of American democracy and its institutions, the lessons of history have become extremely important. The emboldened rise of the extreme white supremacy is not new. These attacks on marginalized groups are not new. And it is in times like this where understanding how these attacks have been confronted in the past become imperative in strategizing our path forward. Being here in Montgomery, the place where the modern civil rights movement began with the bus boycotts in 1955 and the home of the first White House of the Confederacy, has shown us how close we are to repeating a terrible chapter of our history, or of American history. Understanding and connecting to the lives and work of, for example, Rosa Parks, Harriet Tubman, Zora Neale Hurston, Fannie Lou Hamer, Constance Baker Motley. This list can go on and on and on. We'll outline freedom struggles of the past and how they were overcome. With that, we can empower ourselves to continue to stand up and create new spaces that will create what we want this future to look like. Today, we're going to have our conversation for this panel on Black women biographies and the gaps that they fill with Maryemma Graham. She's a distinguished professor emerita at the University of Kansas, founder of the History of Black Writing, a research center she directs from 1983 to 2023, widely known for its numerous funding initiatives in Black literary studies. HBW has been a leading advocate for the use of digital methods in research, teaching, and public engagement. She received an American Book Award for Lifetime Achievement in 2021. Her books include The Cambridge History of African American Literature, Teaching African American Literature, and the translingual volume, please forgive me if I mispronounce this, Toni Morrison, Au-delà du visible ordinaire, Beyond the Visible and Ordinary. Her most recent book is The House Where My Soul Lives, The Life of Margaret Walker. Alexis Pauline Gumbs, is author of Survival is a Promise, The Eternal Life of Audre Lorde. She is a queer Black feminist, love evangelist. She is the recipient of the National Endowment of the Arts, Creative Writing Fellowship, and the National Humanities Center Fellowship. And there's another one up here. She is also a recipient of the Wyndham Campbell Prize in Poetry. She has written 5 books, including Undrowned, Black Feminist Lessons from Marine Animals, which won the 2022 Whiting Award in Nonfiction. Her most recent book, and it's a wonderful read, is Survival is a Promise, The Eternal Life of Audre Lorde. Let's talk. Let's take this. Is that it? Okay. Welcome. I like to start with the two of you, one at a time, obviously, to talk about why you wrote about your subjects, Audre Lorde and Margaret Walker. Whoever wants to go first.
Oh, you go first.
Age before beauty.
Hello, everybody. Delighted to be here, and thank you for being here. Uh, Long journey. The book took 20 years, so to remember why I wrote it sometimes changes over time. But the first thing, it was a book that had to be written. Um, and I guess secondarily, as I promised Margaret Walker that I would do the book because she could not finish it. She wanted to write a memoir. She tried on several occasions. There are manuscripts, they're horrible. Fiction writer, she's good. Poetry, she's good. Essayist, she's good. But the memoir was very late in her life. And so I was teaching at the University of Mississippi, and she had been partly responsible for my coming to Ole Miss when she said, finally somebody can help me. So I knew what that meant. And what we did first, of course, was bring out collections of her work, the collected poems. We did two volumes of her essays, which are absolutely incredible, and a lot more left to be collected. And there had not been a collected body of criticism on her work. And so that was a third volume. And it was sort of natural for me to have studied her in that way and have wonderful interviews with her. She was very generous with her interviews, and she interviewed while she was cooking. So that meant I got to eat and talk to her. And it was always at her kitchen table, and she cooked everything from scratch. So this was a New Orleans delight because she was, of course, from New Orleans, bred, not born. So it was a must book that I needed to do, a promise I had to keep. And I had been doing literary criticism, I've been doing work, but I was not a biographer. But I knew enough about her to at least take the challenge. I'll just give you one more tidbit because Nell is here, and Nell knows that she was the first person that queried me about the book when I had a fellowship at the Schomburg, which was the beginning of the process. And I outlined what I was going to do with the book, and I may have read a section from that I had written, and Nell was just insistent. And I can't remember what the question was, but I know it stumped me. And I very rarely am silent, but I just I just went into silence. I had no idea how to answer her question. And questions kept coming every time I did a presentation. And so I blame that for making the book as long as it is. So it's your fault now. You started the process. But it was that people kept asking me questions. Why are you doing the book? And of course, there was all of the unpleasant criticism and critique of Walker that followed her. And so that was always out there. And so I had to learn how to say why I wanted to do the book. And I said, how could somebody this famous become instantly infamous overnight when she did some things later in her life? That has to be explained. And so I thought that I knew enough and had spent enough time with her and interviewed her enough, and watched her come back around, because I was at the end of that process. When she died in 1998, she had not recovered from all of the horrible experiences and the critiques that had been leveled against her. So it was that commitment, I guess I'd say, that forced me to spend 2 decades on the book and not give up. So sorry for such a long answer.
No, I was just going to ask quickly, when did you begin the process? I know you're saying 2 decades, so.
I also think that I kept thinking that I didn't have it right. That would be the other thing I'd have to say. I'm a rewriter, I'm one of those classic rewrite, overwrite, it's got to get right. And maybe I'm not the person to do it.
Why did you think you didn't have it right?
Because a new idea would come. I talked to somebody. I did so many interviews. I did lots and lots and lots of interviews, and I'll talk about that a little bit later, that I would think of something that changed my way of looking at a particular idea, because there were interviews that I had and information. It's heavily quoted because I did do so, and people were dying on me in the course of 20 years, and I had to talk to everybody and anybody I could talk to who was related to Margaret Walker in any way. And so I felt that urgency. But that urgency didn't translate to writing any faster. But of course, there was a lot going on. But yeah.
Thank you. How about you, Alexis?
Thank you so much for sharing that. I think there's something about someone asking you to write their biography, and then staying true to that after they pass away. And there's another thing when somebody has already died and then they insist that you write their biography, which maybe a little spookier, but I mean, Audre Lorde has been with me since I was 14 years old. I have never stopped researching Audre Lorde, and I wrote about her in my college thesis. I wrote about Kitchen Table Press, which she was a co-founder of, and I wrote about her in my dissertation and had the great gift, but I also think great responsibility of being the first person to research in her archives, which are at Spelman College. And then her students were my teachers. And then her partner, Gloria Joseph, invited me to come live in St. Croix and help her to create The Wind is Spirit. She calls it a bio-anthology, like a collective biography of essays of different people impacted by Audre Lorde. And, you know, I didn't think, like you said, I didn't think of myself as a biographer. I thought I was a scholar who would always teach people about Audre Lorde and found creative ways to do that in my community. But I thought that the 2004 biography of Audre Lorde, Warrior Poet by Alexis DeVoe, was wonderful and incredible, and I learned a lot from it as a reader. And I didn't think that necessarily Audre Lorde would need 2 biographies by 2 poets named Alexis, but turns out she does. So Alexis DeVoe came and sat in my kitchen and did an interview with another one of my mentors, Sharon Bridgeforth, about why she wrote Warrior Poet, how she came to write Warrior Poet, and then she exclaimed, and really with like some anger and urgency, she said, "And I don't see why no one else has written another biography since." And I felt convicted, you know, I felt like I was trying to hide behind a glass of water, which is clear. So I experienced that, and I just took a deep breath, and I didn't say, "I'll do it." I just didn't say anything at all. And then the next day, I got a phone call from the person who's now my literary agent, who said, you know, "It really seems like it's time for a new biography of Audre Lorde, and I've been asking different Black feminist scholars who should be the person to write it, and everyone keeps saying you, whoever you are." And I was like, that was the next day. You know, Alexis DeVoe had just left my house, and I was like, at a certain point, it becomes disrespectful to not go ahead and say yes when you're receiving your assignment, indeed, from a ghost. So that's one answer as to why. And it wasn't until after I actually had published this book that I realized, you know, there's like almost 30 biographies of Sylvia Plath. And I'm not saying Sylvia Plath isn't important, but I am saying she's not more important than Audre Lorde. I will say that. And I think that we do need the stories of people who are not well known. There's so much writing for us to do, but I also think that we need the care and nuance to really have our figures, especially figures who have who become useful in a way that can sometimes actually shortchange the complexity of who they were. I think that we have a responsibility to stay complicated with stories about people who are important to us or who are precedents for many of us. Audre Lorde is a precedent for me. And I would say that I mean, I know you're going to ask us more good questions about the gaps, but I would say one of the reasons that I was passionate about a biography of Audre Lorde at this time and for the future is because I think that what, not Alexis DeVoe necessarily, but I think that what the general public who feel that they are familiar with Audre Lorde have missed is really one of the most urgent aspects of her story and her commitment, which is about our relationship to this planet. And so Audre Lorde's poetry, which people don't read in favor of her essays, so that's another bone I have to pick and another reason for the way I wrote this biography, she's always talking about the earth, a geological scale. She's talking about nature, and it's not just decorative. It's central to her project. And she was an environmental activist. She was part of organizations against nuclear irresponsibility from her time as a student. She talked about the fact that absolutely we need to be able to have complex intersectional conversations, but if we don't get right in relationship to this planet, we don't have any place to have these conversations. And I think that that's the hardest part of her work. I think it's actually the hardest call that Audre Lorde and many other Black feminists have been making over time. And it feels like one of the most urgent calls that we could answer in this time. And so I really wanted to focus on that in this biography. And I'm really grateful to have the space to share it with you all.
Thank you. And I am one of those that focus on Audre Lorde's essays.
I know.
But I thank you for writing this about the poetry because both of you wrote books about poets and you led us through their poetry and what they were thinking. And it was a really interesting way of looking at the interiority of Audre Lorde and Margaret Walker. So thank you for giving us that opportunity to learn on that level. I wanted to move on a little bit to talk a little bit about the world our two wonderful authors were born into.
This is interesting. That's right. And I will forget this. It's interesting because Walker saw herself in having lived from a very different period and then entered into what we familiarly call the Black women's literary renaissance. I mean, she saw herself, this was like a moment for her where she recognized the importance of Black women's coming of age in a literary context. And so she got to know a generation of poets, including Audre Lorde, and was not always on good terms with them. And because she was a feisty young woman and older woman. I have to say that, because I knew her as an older woman and she was no less feisty as other people have told me. So that experience of starting in the 1930s and 40s, having the first nationally recognized award-winning volume of poetry, and not happening for a really long time until Gwendolyn Brooks, and then later it became a little bit more common. But seeing the birth of this 1970s, and then Walker taking the initiative, which is still amazing to me, having done conferences myself, all of us have done conferences, how she managed to pull something off in 1973 and have all those poets, and many of us, and I was just thinking, beginning graduate school, to come to Mississippi of all places.
And this is for the Phyllis Wheatley
Festival. And people remember that. Of course, we had a 50th anniversary of it last year. So she took the initiative to do that. And that's when she met this entire generation of poets where they fought and loved and ate and did all kinds of things together. And there's this wonderful picture of them in a beautiful green area of her backyard. But Walker's sort of insistence of being on time, in time. Or maybe in time, on time. Anyway, it was that, yes, my era is past in a sense, but what I can do is be a conduit for what is new, which is why I used the term the midwife of the movement, because she brought, and they had never been together like that, but in Mississippi. And I think that piece of Walker's sensibility where she said, the reason I have difficulty is that I'm a woman, I'm Black, and I'm Southern. She said that all the time. So I'm gonna have difficulty getting the kind of attention, but what if I use my platform as those three things to do what I do? Let's see what happens, and that's what she did. She insisted on all those three things, like the meals that she cooked for people when they came to her house. If she had a conference, she would have a full meal for all of you to eat. Built a house that could accommodate 100 or more people. And so that she was part of that wave, that shift, that generational shift, insisting on being important to it, if not facilitating it. So, yeah.
And just before I get you to talk about her birth, what was Audre Lorde's response to being at the Phyllis Wheatley? I'm sorry. What was Audre Lorde's response to being at the Phyllis Wheatley conference? We have both biographers here.
Yes. Audre Lorde was one of the 21 Black women poets that Margaret Walker gathered, including herself. And that, to me, is just the cosmic, like she said, there's going to be 21, or maybe she's going to say, I'm going to gather 20 other poets because it's 200 years since Phyllis Wheatley published this book, and then she was the one, right, making it 21. Audre Lorde was, I mean, it was a complicated time. She was happy, she was excited to be included. She, at that time, was circulating in the world as one of the broadside poets. And this was important in terms of recognition, but she was also experiencing homophobia and sexism in the midst of that. It had been Gwendolyn Brooks who had used her, similarly, her mothering of the Black arts movement to insist to a Black arts establishment that wasn't necessarily checking for Audre Lorde, like, no, you need to highlight this woman, you need to feature this poet. And so I think that, some of those intense conversations, and I love the way it's documented, because you can see the pictures and they're like leaning in, like,
And they're coupled in groups too.
Yeah, they're in groups, and it was such an incredible, it shows Margaret Walker's intersection with her community, because they were on the news, they were all interviewed, they had this whole slate of events that they did, so there was no way that this was going to be forgotten, that these 21 poets, and then of course historians like Paula Giddings, and that all of these people gathered. And I think at that time, though, Audre Lorde was wrestling a lot with what it meant for her to represent and to also feel suppressed and closeted in a particular way. This would have been, so the year is
1973.
1973, so that would have been.
Yeah, so
And they've had fights at the festival.
Yeah,
Yes, battles.
Yes, and you can tell. So she's not yet 40, right? And so Audre Lorde talks about turning 40. She started to identify as a high priestess of 40, and she would celebrate when other people turned 40, because she would say that 40 was when she stopped caring, right? So 40 was this time where she was like, I don't care who knows that I'm a lesbian. I don't care what they think about it. I don't care what they think is the gap between what they think I should be doing and what I know I'm here to do. And she felt so freed by that, but she wasn't quite there when she came down to Mississippi. And for me, as a person who has obsessively looked at pictures of Audre Lorde over and over again, you can see it. You can see the holding in, and even that beautiful picture where it's Audre Lorde, it's June Jordan, it's Lucille Clifton, they're singing the Negro National Anthem together at that opening night of the Phyllis Wheatley gathering. I feel like you can see all of it. You can see, like, she's proud, and she's like, my whole self isn't quite here yet, though. Yeah.
Interesting. Did that also help her to have, sure. Did that also help her to figure out also what kind of poet she would be? Well, she was already a poet, but how she would educate others, like when she was becoming an educator and also creating a platform, sharing a platform for her students, and even later on creating a safe space for poets. So, like, this gathering have helped her, inspired her at this point?
Yes, and also in the connection that it made, because then she came back to Tougaloo as a National Endowment for the Arts funded poet visiting poet scholar at Tougaloo, and that's when she came back to Mississippi, reconnected with Margaret Walker. That was transformative for her, and that's when she understood that she was an educator. So she was a librarian who was also a poet. Up until then, she came to Tougaloo and created a publication with the students. And when you read this publication, it was called Pound, the honesty, the vulnerability, they're talking about mental health and depression. They're talking about things that when you think about Tougaloo and when you think about, first of all, I also heard that Tougaloo brought her there. Talladega wouldn't have Audre Lorde come, right? So when you think about the respectability politics of HBCUs, she came to Tougaloo, the students loved her, and I have the student evaluations because she kept them. And they were like, can she come back? How can we have her back? Couldn't it have been longer? They just really loved her presence, but part of that was because they got to create something together where they felt like they were really speaking her truth. So, and then Margaret Walker has Alice Walker write to Audre Lorde, because when Alice Walker is there working with the students, they're still talking about Audre Lorde. And Alice Walker mentions this in a letter to Audre Lorde where she says, can you tell me what you did right? Because evidently, it went really well for you. So yes, all of that was part of her turning point of understanding herself as an educator. And that was really her first time in a college classroom. And then, she went on to continue teaching for many years.
And in Tougaloo, this is when she went to Tougaloo.
So that she would have been late 70s.
Yeah, it was
late in the 70s, because Alice was there.
Sorry.
It's on.
Very sorry.
So Alice was there before 70, 71, and because she took over longer. She stayed longer. She also took over Walker's class when Walker was away. So Audrey would have been there later in the 70s, as far as I could recall.
Yeah, it was probably 74 that she actually came. So I think it was 73 that same year where she actually got the grant to go.
But she didn't go until later.
And it was the same time that she published the first cities. So it would have been really close after the conference.
What I love is just that this is giving you the history of how this is building up the Black Studies department that we see coming up in the 80s and 90s. And this is the foundational part of it, or at least in the 70s, foundational part of it, because it's a continuation from even before that.
And I just want to say here, because this is a misconception we often had, that somehow Black Studies did not have a centrality in HBCUs. And the Civil Rights Movement blended very quickly, or evolved very quickly into what was happening in terms of Black women's writing, and the importance of that in these smaller institutions like Tougaloo, certainly Jackson State, because Walker brought everybody there. From every continent there was, she would bring people to Jackson State, and she had access to funding like nobody I've ever seen in that period. So that, I like the idea that we are reintegrating the history, or telling that correct history of the evolution of Black Studies, which is seen as kind of a northern urban phenomenon much too often, and as if somehow Black schools were excluded altogether. In fact, there was a lot happening, and it was mainly because of people like Walker who would make sure that they used that platform.
Power of biography, correcting the records. I'm going to move on to my next question here, and that is, let's see. I wanted to talk to you, Maryemma, about, because you knew Margaret Walker, what was that like writing her story because you knew her? That's a different process than if you don't know them, your subject.
Yeah, I have crafted an answer to that because people have asked me about it, and I say there are 3 voices in the book. It took, and maybe that's where the 20 years took. It's like, how do I do this? I had so much information Margaret kept journals from the time she was 10 or 12 years old. So 135 3-ring binders, double-sided, handwritten journals. That was just part of it. Every train receipt, every time she created a new recipe for some food, letters that she would draft in note form before writing them and sending them out to people. So there was an incredible archive. And of course there is an archive in a center which is storing her archive and her papers. So it was very clear to me in the very beginning that Margaret Walker's voice would have to be in the book, full center. It would have to be her words, quoted as much as I could within reason. And again, which is why this is a big ass book, as it's commonly called. But that I had to interpret the story. The third element for me was all the people I interviewed. I wanted that voice to be a different voice. How are people seeing this, perhaps differently from Margaret's view and from my view? Because there were differences in debates and arguments, and she fell in and out of love with people. She hated me for some periods of time. It was all kind of conflict going on. And I didn't want it to be a perfect rounded picture, but I wanted to give the facts as they evolved. I mean, she had a conflicted life, personal, professional, political, all of that. And yet she accomplished so much. But those three voices I felt were essential for people and distinguish among the three voices. You know when I'm talking, you know when I'm interpreting. It may not be the same as what Walker is saying in her journals that are also heavily excerpted, or what other people said about it, but the interviews I did. I had those people also comment on things. And so that for me was the structure that I tried to keep consistent throughout the book, the three different voices.
Wow. And I just have a question about permissions.
Yes.
Yeah. Using journals and obviously letters, we require to have this process that we have to go to get permission to use that. How was that for you, for using journals? Because you do use them extensively.
Yeah, well, that came with her request to write this book.
Okay.
It's like, I left the journals, now it's your job to include them in this book you write about me. I mean, she was a very intentional person. You know, if I want you to write the book, and I left the journals over there. You know, they came and got them the other day. They are over and they're now digitized, so you can access these things. They are preserved at the Margaret Walker Center.
Wow.
And so it was understood that I would read all of those journals that she left because her voice would have to be in the book. There was never any question about that. And so she indicated that this is a collection that should be open to the public. I want people to know what I said, what I wrote. I didn't get to finish what I think was a longer life that I would have liked to have lived. Mm-hmm. But at least the documents are here for others to read. So she was very clear. And of course now they're giving permission for people to access. But she made it very clear that if I were to do this story, I'd have to have access to that.
Okay.
So the permission was never a problem.
How about you, Alexis? Because you also use journals.
Yes, so as I said, Audrey Wood kept her journals. They're part of her archive at Spelman. And so the permissions, I mean, they still are her intellectual property, so they're still managed through her estate. I don't know if that's what you're asking about. You're asking about those logistics?
Part of the process of quoting from journals and
Right.
letters, you do have to get permission from different estates or people, and I'm just curious how that was, because both of you use them extensively.
Yeah. I mean, I think just to say, I mean, we all know this, and it was mentioned earlier that not everybody keeps their journals. I know, I won't name this person, but I know someone who has given their archives to an important institution and it burned their personal journals because I know, like, we here are heartbroken because we're like, how can you? But this person, there were certain things they just didn't want their kids to ever see, and now they won't. So I think that it is we can't take it for granted that it is a really vulnerable act to have your journals become part of the public record. But that was definitely something that Audre Lorde did intentionally. It was not an issue with the estate, to quote from the journals. It was more the conversation with the estate had to do with her unpublished poems, like her poems that she wrote when she was younger, which are in the journals or in their own, poetry notebooks or revisions or drafts. And because of who Audre Lorde is as a poet and her process and her poetics is really important to this work, that was more a part of the conversation. And
Okay.
there were some who were like, well, if she had wanted it to be seen like that, she would have published it like that in the final version. And I'm like, well, yes, but it is a literary biography, and the process and thinking and the brilliance of the poet is actually sometimes in the revision. But anyway, ultimately, it was all able to be there, which I'm happy about.
I appreciate you demystifying that process for us. I want to jump a little bit to Maryemma, because I want to share this. This, you talk about in her biography about her relationship with Richard Wright. I'm sorry, this isn't even about Richard Wright. This is about Alex Haley.
Alex Haley, yeah.
So, and with her book Jubilee, I want to let you to explain this. But what I liked about this is a booklet of Margaret Walker herself setting the record straight about her work being plagiarized by Alex Haley. And not a lot of people knew about this. She did sue Alex Haley, and she lost that suit, but her book kind of stayed in publication, which that lawsuit may have helped that. But I wanted to allow the expert here to talk more about it and not leave it to me, the novice.
First, we want to thank Walker Evans.
Yes.
Dr. Walker
Dr.
Evans.
Walter Evans.
Yes, who came from Detroit, moved back to Savannah, his home state, his hometown, but was kind of a benefactor for Margaret Walker. And he brought her to Detroit periodically to give talks. And on one of those visits, it was after she had filed a suit against Alex Haley, that she was insistent on making her case in every public setting. And people kept saying to her, just don't talk about it so much. But you couldn't shut Margaret Walker up. And so he proposed, let you tell your story, and I'll just publish it. And it's called Setting the Record Straight. So that anytime anybody asks you, you can just give them the book. You don't have to go through the diatribe. And he gave me a copy of the book.
He gave me a
and
copy.
I have it as an image in the book because I wanted people to see. But it was believed to be her instant downfall. And I'll add one other bit of information, which was, a very dear moment for me. Before Nikki Giovanni passed, and I did not know she was ill, but she called me and she said, we need to tape an interview because I want to talk about the Margaret Walker book. Nikki had read it. She told me about it. I said, well, let's do it at whatever time because I was going to try to get some money to do all this. She said, no. I got the filmmakers. You just come. So we did it in the spring. It was after her Going to Mars video was done, award-winning. And the same film people agreed to do it. And so Nikki reiterated how adamant she was that Margaret not sue Alex Haley. Because she said to her, this is going to kill whatever reputation you have left. And that is exactly what happened. That if you go on record as suing Alex Haley for plagiarism, other people sued him and won, you all know that. But if she was the first, if you do that, that's just going to kill you. And so Nikki begged her not to do it. So we have that on record, film. We got to figure out what to do with the footage. This was the suit.
When?
This was 1970.
When what?
Roots came. Roots, 1976. Nikki, we did this in the spring.
This year.
This year. Nikki died in December. This was done in the spring. I was trying to wait.
2024.
2024.
2024.
Yeah. Now, she had told me this already, but she wanted to go on record as saying it in a public way so that whenever Nikki knew she was whatever, she insisted on doing this 6 months before she passed. Wow. So this was, again, done in the spring of 24. That's right. Nikki died, in December, many of you know. So, but it was decidedly something Walker felt she had to do. She was just adamant about it, but more people than not advised her not to do that. And they were concerned about her reputation. That was the way it came off with everyone I interviewed. You don't want to do this, but she did. And of course, what they predicted did in fact happen. Because she lost her suit. It was dismissed. Other people won, and then he bailed on a few others because it was going to continuously emerge as, obviously, and we know what the end result 20 years later was on that case, that there was no such thing as evidence or documentation that what he said he did, he did. In fact, he had a Roots project where people collected all the material that had been written, including Margaret Walker's Jubilee, and they borrowed and lifted from various materials, so there was plagiarism involved. But that was years later. She was dead and gone.
But she talks about it.
She talks about it. She would not claim victory.
No, she won't.
I did that, I've suffered, and it was over. She blamed it on a kind of pride, hubris. She's a deeply religious woman, that was what drove her to do what she thought was the right thing, and she should have listened to her friends, but she did not. And that was the thing that made it really difficult when I talked to people about this book, because the only thing people could remember at that point wasn't she the person who sued Alex Haley? Nobody remembered anything else about Margaret Walker later than that. It overshadowed much of her reputational capital. It was difficult, and I think it affected my publisher's response because they were getting some feedback too. The person who acquired the manuscript had left the publishing company. You know what happens when that happens. You lose the person you have a working relationship with. But it was a devastating experience for an old woman, because she was an older woman at this time that this happened, and it basically curtailed whatever career she had left.
Wow. How old was she?
This was, what, 65, between 65 and 70? And she had retired fairly early, and of course, the other piece of that is that she wrote a book about Richard Wright, and people, that sort of folded into that, and people said, well, there you go. She was jealous of Alex Haley, and she's jealous of Richard Wright. She must have been in love with him, and 2 times. That was the end of the reputation, such as it was.
This is going to be my last question to both of you. I want, again, Maryemma, you actually rescued Margaret Walker, again, from her reputation and telling us her story, because she is so much more than this lawsuit. But what would you say was the gap that she fills? How should we remember her?
Yeah.
And why is she important even today?
Yeah.
So I think what I figured out I needed to do was to make Walker larger than those pieces that people knew. And so we've been using the word institution builder as one way of kind of framing her, because once she recognized or decided she was not going to leave Jackson State, and she did have offers, like many people did who went to PWIs from HBCUs. I'm the beneficiary, and I have to say that, of that experience, because I studied at Cornell, but my major professor was J. Saunders Redding, who had been at Hampton forever and ever, and he spent his last few years at Cornell, and I was the person who came into grad school. So I felt like I lucked out by having that kind of education. But Walker never left Jackson State. And what she was able to do was to create a space where she had control. I mean, she would have conferences. We mentioned one. It was not the only one.
Right.
She was doing what we call today in-service institutes. And I've recently learned that that term actually came from another black educator, also Mississippian. And we've got more stories that have to write, more gaps to fill, because women have been playing a role that have just not been recognized. But I think she made it clear that if you could be in a place and have the kind of access that you do, you have to be community driven. You have to be forward looking. You have to be public facing. And all of those things, and these are terms we use today, she was doing all of that before those terms evolved.
Right.
And so giving a space where people could, I mean, she did art exhibits, she, as I said, international conferences, bringing people, politicians from Africa. This is the era in the 60s and 70s where leadership is transitioning. She'd bring people to Jackson State and invite everybody to come. And she knew the politicians, US politicians, she knew African politicians. So she used her place as a platform. And I think in that sense, she was vocal, she had access, and she centered Jackson State, particularly Mississippi, since Mississippi was so central to the civil rights movement. She made herself a conduit through which many of those things could occur by bringing and exposing students to those people, because she also would have conferences where students were presenting.
Mm-hmm.
We think we do that now and it's pretty hip. Walker was doing that. I met many of the students who said, yeah, I had a session with Alex Haley. They were friends at one time.
Mm-hmm.
He was, and I introduced him, a student. So Walker was forcing herself into a position of power where she gave other people access because of the control that she had.
Wonderful. And I'm going to pose it to you too, Alexis, about Audre Lorde.
Well, also, but just to add about Margaret Walker, I mean, and to reiterate that when these poets came to the celebration of Phyllis Wheatley, the understanding of what Jackson State was, it was the place where the Guard killed those students for protesting, right? It was this grief. Alice Walker has a letter to June Jordan where she talks about feeling like she's just surrounded by beasts, right? Who are killing the children. You know, the trauma and the impact of that violence on that community, that whole community, because the students at Tougaloo and, you know, everybody in the surrounding area was impacted by
And a
that.
high school student was killed. High
Yes.
school, not just college students.
Right. High school, not just college students were killed. You didn't say it to the microphone, so I'm just
that's right,
repeating it
that's right.
for whoever writes about this gathering in the future to be able to hear it in the audio. And so to then not only create this epic historic gathering in honor of Phyllis Wheatley, but to then go on and stay with Jackson State and continue to create what she created. It really was, I mean, now I don't want to use the word redemptive because we already learned about the word redemption, but it really was something that transformed the story of the institution after such a traumatic event. So I just wanted to underline that. For Audre Lorde, I mean, Audre Lorde did not know that Langston Hughes had relationships with men. She knew Langston Hughes. She was part of the Harlem Writers Guild with him. Nobody ever said that that was a part of his life. So she didn't know that. So she felt like she was the only person in that space, right? She didn't know that Angelina Wells Grimke had lived around the corner from her and was a Black woman poet who had loved women. She didn't know that Alice Dunbar Nelson was a Black woman writer who loved women until Akasha Gloria Hull, who was Audre Lorde's own mentee, wrote about her years later. And so she talks about the way that she suffered for feeling like she was alone in spaces where she wasn't even alone, but because of the silences that were held and the stories that weren't told and the gaps in the stories of even the people that she knew about, she suffered and she watched other people of her generation suffer worse and be institutionalized in mental institutions and die by suicide. And so she understood the cost of those gaps in an intimate way. And so this is why, and this is how she answered the question when people said, why do you say, I am a Black, lesbian, feminist, warrior, poet, mother? Like, why do you say it every time, everywhere you go and everywhere you speak? She says, because I didn't know Langston Hughes was gay. And I don't want it to be that there's somebody who encounters me in their life and there's an aspect of who I am that they can use and they never get it. She was like, I refuse for that to be the case. And that's why when Barbara Smith spoke at MLA convention in 1974, and she said, 77, she said, I am a Black, lesbian, feminist, literary critic, wondering if it's possible to be that and live to tell the tale. Audre Lorde took it as her personal responsibility to tell her life story and the story of those who didn't survive. So she created this composite biomythography, Zami, which has been a life-saving text for generations after that, in response to understanding that Barbara Smith, Akasha Holt, the people that she met at that MLA conference were younger Black feminist critics, and they didn't know what a Black lesbian born in the 30s, like what that was, what their lives were. So I mean, Audre Lorde really refused to leave those silences and leave those gaps. And I also think that there's still more, and there's still more nuance there. And I think about the fact that we have a generation now who is subject to a 24-hour news cycle, who is doom scrolling, who is able to find out about the multiple disasters happening all over the world at once in real time in a way that's profoundly overwhelming. But they have to be able to learn from a generation of Black women writers who were born in Harlem, Audre Lorde, Toni Cade Bambara, June Jordan, who were growing up next to the atom bomb being developed, right? And who were, as other people who are in their 90s now are, the first generation to actually grow up knowing that human beings had created the technology to eradicate the whole species. And were told by their elders, well, hide under your desk. Hide under your desk if it happens, which will not save you in nuclear war, which I know you all know. So I think that their theories of what survival means are important to us, so that there's not a generation who thinks that they're the first people to think about this. None of us are the first, and those younger than me are not the first to be able to be witness to the possibility that this society not only erases its history, but erases its future. And that is, I think that's part of what's at stake in telling the stories that we need to tell with the nuance we need to tell it with.
Thank you. You have a couple of minutes, and I will allow for some questions. So, anybody have any questions? Kirk and I actually made a deal. He's going to take that side, and I will take this side.
Just real quick, while we're asking the questions, we need to bring our caterer in and let her set up. So we may need to just kind of silently scoot past you all in the back, if that's okay.
Hi, so thanks very much for this panel. Jeff Tucker, I teach at the University of Rochester. I have a very basic and kind of fundamental question, which is just maybe to invite the panel to say more about writing biographies of literary figures, and what does the term literary biography mean to you? And what's the relationship between being a literary critic and a biographer?
That's a good question.
How do they overlap? How are they distinct?
You want to speak to that first?
Yeah.
Very good question, because we keep asking ourselves this as well. And I know that I was working with a recently deceased writer who had a literary career, had publications, many of which were, had not appeared in print, so that I would have to interpret the work that she did, why she did it, what it meant, impact that it had. And so I was using the literary biographer's lens to give, but it was only one of the many lenses that I knew I had to use, because it was a much bigger story there to be told. I think that Arnold Rampersad gave us kind of a notion of what the literary biographer was supposed to be. And that was a model for a lot of us who were doing biographies, as opposed to, say, Du Bois. But Arnold was looking so closely at the work that Hughes produced in relation to his life. Didn't want to talk about gay or anything else. We know that.
Right.
And we challenged Arnold about that. That's why he does his disappearing acts. That's another story. So the literary, for me, merges with, the sort of scholar or the interpreter, and also because the last two readers I had for my book, my daughter was one of them who's in the room, but I had a school teacher read the manuscript. And I wanted to make sure that this book was accessible to somebody who did not know who Margaret Walker was, but got a full sense of who she was through the book. And I wasn't satisfied until, those reads and responses to those reads had come back to me, although other kinds of reads had been done. So we mixed, at least I know I mixed the literary biography notion with the interpreting a life notion.
Yeah, that's so powerful, and I agree that was also something that was at stake with me. I was presenting at a workshop at the National Humanities Center for K through 12 teachers who are teaching African American studies under duress in these times, as you know. It was really important to me that they could work with this book, and they could incorporate Audre Lorde into their curriculums, who was targeted and named as a specific person who should be banned from K through 12 curricula. I would say the literary biography, I don't know. I think that what it means to me may not be what it means, right? So I'll just say that to other people, even in the room, and certainly in the tradition. Yes, it definitely meant that Audre Lorde's poetry and her poetics are central to the book, are central to my understanding of her legacy, right? Because in the work, it's not just that, like, okay, we can understand a certain point in her life, especially since many of her poems she revised from teenagehood to like way later, and then she went back and revised them again and published a whole set of revisions of the same poem she had already published. So she, like many writers and like many of us also in the room, never stopped revising. And her life, her daughter, Elizabeth Lord Rollins, who was also Rachel Sworn's babysitter, turns out, who knew? She said, my mother was an activist because she had to be. In the time she was born in, she had to be an activist. But my mother was a poet because she was a poet. And she believed that if her mother had been born in any time on any planet, she would have been a poet. And I wanted to honor that as the central purpose of her life and her own understanding of her life. But at the same time, the energy that's in the work, it exceeds the person's life. It exceeds in possibility, and across different readerships, it exceeds that linearity. And it was important to me for that to be a part of it. And I also wanted to write something like that Audre Lorde would like to read. Now, she read everything, whether she liked its poetics or not, and then she would talk about it. But I wanted to create a biography that was also literature, in the sense that it teaches you so much about the person, but it also in its form is doing that work that exceeds. So I think that what we mean by the term literary can mean a lot of things, but I definitely think attending to what, in my case, and you know, in the case of Margaret Walker, of course, also what a poem is and what a poem does. And the fact that what a poem is and what a poem does is more about possibility than about simple description. The ways that it can move beyond a narrative sense of time and space, what a poem can do, is really important to my question of what's at stake and what this book could possibly do.
I'm going to say thank you. And we're going to break for lunch soon. So thank you, everybody.
I want to hear. I
on
want
the
to hear
road.
more. I know.
Yeah.
We really should go on the road.
You know, the other thing that we didn't say there is that we don't have the luxury in, you made that point about how many biographies of these other writers